Hello and welcome back to Kilmainham Jail for another one of our Kilmainham Jail on lockdown videos. This is the seventh and final part of our series on the Invincibles, and I suppose rather appropriately we're going to finish up by looking at the fate of James Carey, because James Carey was the man largely responsible for setting up the Invincibles here in Dublin. He was also, with his decision to confess and testify against his former comrades, the man responsible for sending at least 5 of them to their deaths here in Kilmainham Jail in the hangman's noose. Now, when he decided to confess, Inspector Mallon, who was in charge of the police investigation, had him separated and placed in a separate room away from the rest of the prisoners. And we believe it was opposite the rooms that had been occupied by Charles Stewart Parnell. Those of you who've been here on a tour may have visited this room because it's also believed to be the room where Robert Emmet spent his last night before his execution in 1803. And Carey would probably have been then in this room in May and June of 1883 as his former comrades in the Invincibles were hanged in one of the yards of the jail. And I can't imagine he wasn't aware of what was happening elsewhere in the building at that time. Interestingly, he managed to smuggle out a letter while he was a prisoner in Kilmainham. Carey was a successful businessman and a member of the City Council, and he wrote to the Lord Mayor apologising for the fact that he'd missed the last meeting where they had selected the new Lord Mayor. Now, I don't think anybody was really expecting him to turn up for the meeting, even if he wasn't a prisoner in Kilmainham Jail, because if he had turned out in public at the time, it's very likely he might have been torn limb from limb because he had become such a figure of hate in the city. He was eventually smuggled out by Inspector Mallon late one evening. A cab arrived to bring him to what was then referred to as Kingstown, now Dunleary, where he was going to get the boat to London and join his family. The plan was from there he would get passage to South Africa and start a new life under the new name of James Power. Inspector Mallon tells a really interesting story about that cab ride from Kilmainham Jail, however. They were passing along James Street, and just where it turns into Thomas Street, they passed the tobacconist shop that had been owned by Daniel Curley, one of the Invincibles executed in Kilmainham. And apparently James Carey made a big show of saying, "God rest the poor soul of Daniel Curley." When Mallon heard this, and it would seem that Mallon hadn't a lot of time for Carey at all. This show of hypocrisy outraged him, and he accused James Carey of being a villain, and he's saying, "Don't you know that you sent that man to his death?" Anyway, Carey continued his journey on to London, was reunited with his family, and then got aboard a ship that was heading to Cape Town in South Africa. The idea was then that he would change ships in Cape Town and head on then to Natal, to Port Elizabeth. And while he was on board the ship, he made friends with a man from Donegal called Patrick O'Donnell, and they became very good friends. And when they docked in Cape Town, he convinced O'Donnell to join him and his family and settle in Natal. But while he was ashore in Cape Town, O'Donnell and a number of the other passengers came across some newspapers and became aware that the man they referred to as James Power was in fact the notorious James Carey. O'Donnell was very angered by this, and he got back on the ship, and in the saloon of the ship he accused James Carey of being the notorious James Carey who had betrayed his friends. Now, depending on whose account you believe, either Carey pulled a gun on O'Donnell, or O'Donnell in a fit of temper pulled his gun, but the result was the same. James Carey was shot dead on board the Melrose. They docked in Port Elizabeth, and Patrick O'Donnell was sent back to London, where he stood trial, and he himself was executed in December of 1883. And with that last twist, the story of the Invincibles comes to an end. Now, if you're interested in finding out more, as I mentioned in the first video, a lot of the information for this series came from Shane Kenna's book on the Invincibles. Shane used to be a guide here and was a great friend to us all. And I suppose this series is one of our ways of paying tribute to his great work and the great loss of his death at such a young age a number of years ago. Okay, so that's the end of the series, but we'll be back with more videos in the coming days. Thank you and stay safe.